MERN, of course, stands for MongoDB, Express, React, and Node. And we want to have these four technologies work together. We want to build a full stack web application where these four technologies are used because they tend to work together really well. But how do they work together? How are they connected? The R, React, is responsible for the client side, for the browser side, for what the user sees, so the presentation and the user interface. This means that we will use React.js to build our front-end facing web application, the thing that runs in the browser. React.js, as you should know, is of course based on JavaScript. It's a JavaScript library, and it's JavaScript that is executed in the browser. So React is used to build beautiful and highly reactive user interfaces in the browser. It's there to render something onto the screen and re-render it whenever something changes, update the user interface, and provide a great user experience to our end users. Put in other words, React is responsible for what the user sees in the end. React alone is great, and we can build stunning user interfaces with it. But of course, if we only work with React, we have some limitations. Most importantly, we're not really able to execute any logic on a server. So in a place where users can't see our code, they can see it in the browser. Anyone can use the browser DevTools to look into our code. And in addition to running code the user can't see or running more performance-intensive tasks, which we also don't want to do in the browser, in addition to that, we typically also want to store some data in a persistent storage, and the browser side is not such a persistent storage. Users can clear the data there. The browser might clear data on its own if it's running out of space, so data there is not persistent. It's also not shareable across all users of our web applications, because if we store data in the browser, of course, it's only readable by that browser, so in the end, by that user, and not of other users of our web application. For an online shop where users are able to create products which should be visible to any user, that would be bad. So that's why we need a so-called backend, a server side. This is a web application that runs on a dedicated machine, a server, somewhere in the internet, reachable by anyone, so opened up to incoming internet connections, and that server is created and run with the help of Node.js and a Node framework, Express.js. These two pieces are used to write JavaScript code that runs on a server, detached from our client, from our browser. There we can run any business logic which we might want to hide from our users or which is more performance intensive. Since we run it on a dedicated machine, a dedicated server, we don't rely on the machine of our users, which is great. We also can use Node and Express for file storage, and we will in this course. And therefore, this is an important part of a real web application. Now, this server side and the client side, so the browser, communicate with requests and responses, HTTP requests and responses, specifically so-called AJAX, or as I like to call them, behind-the-scenes requests and responses. Requests and responses triggered from client-side JavaScript so that they are sent to the server and the response is handled in the client without reloading the page on the client. That is achieved by exchanging data, which is not a HTML page, which would be rendered by the browser and which would therefore lead to a page refresh, but instead which is in a so-called JSON format. There also are other formats you could use, and we'll have a look at one other format in this course, but JSON is by far the most common format for exchanging data. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's a machine-readable and also quite human-readable data format, which in the end is used to exchange text data, numeric data, and structured data in any form. This data is attached to both requests sent from the client to the server and responses received by the client incoming from the server to then re-render something on the client side, so using React to re-render parts of the UI, or to do something on the server side if the data is received there. For example, store it in a database. Now, speaking of that, the database, MongoDB, is missing in this picture. Now, that's our third building block, if you want to call it like this. We also have an extra database server which runs our MongoDB engine. And that's really important to understand. In the end of this picture, there are three big blocks working together. Two servers, one running our Node.js app and one running the database engine, and the client side. That's also involved, of course. Now, that database server can run on the same machine as our Node.js server or on a totally different machine. That doesn't really matter. The database server in MongoDB is then used for the persistent data storage, not file storage. You should always store files on a file system, not in a database, but any other data, like the name of a product, the price of a product, the users of our web application. Things like that would be stored in a database like MongoDB. Now, the important question, when we have a look at this incomplete picture here, is who's talking to the database server? And that is our Node.js application. That application sends database queries using the MongoDB SDK, or a MongoDB library to be precise, to that database server. We don't send requests from the client side directly to the database. Why? Because to send these queries, we need to include our database credentials, so the username and password to log into our database, so to say. As I mentioned earlier, all the code that runs on the client side, so in the browser, is readable by all your users. There is no way of disabling this. This is how the web works. So if that code would include the credentials for your database, your users could hack your database. They could gain access to it. So we do this on the server side, where the code is not readable by our users. And from the client side, we just send requests and responses to the server. And on the server, we decide which requests we want to handle and which responses we want to send back. So we have full control on the server side, and the client is only able to communicate with the server within the request-response patterns we allow. And that is, of course, what we will build in detail throughout this course. This is the big picture for the MERN architecture. This is how all the pieces work together and which pieces are involved in the first place. And this architecture allows us to build amazing web applications, highly scalable and very fast web applications with a beautiful and highly reactive user interface powered by React attached to them. Now with that, let's take a closer look at some of these building blocks.